Between now and noon, we'll hear 3 presentations. Each will have about 20 minutes to present, and we'll deal with question and answer at the end. So if you have questions for our speakers, you're probably getting used to this by now, but type them into the Q&A box. And it helps us if you say who the question is for, if you want a particular speaker to address that. If you type something in the chat, we aren't going to see it. So we can only see the Q&A box. So please put your questions there. The first presentation this hour will be Innovation Showdown, a collaborative approach to locate New Zealand mudsnails. And our speakers are Maureen Kalscheur and Laura Holder. Maureen is a statewide aquatic invasive species monitoring lead for the Wisconsin DNR, and Laura is the executive director for Midwest Conservation Dogs. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Joe. So our title of our talk is Innovation Showdown, and we've got a great picture of this black lab, Betty White. Our co-authors, I just want to acknowledge up front, we're from the Wisconsin DNR, that's me, Maureen, Ferry. Well, Maureen Kalscheur is my legal last name. Shelby Adler and Alex Sell from River Alliance. We worked with Ellen Voss, Matt Walrath from the Upper Sugar River Watershed, and both Laura Holder and Amy Wagnitz from the Midwest Conservation Dogs. Can you go next slide? And we're going to talk about New Zealand mudsnails, a project we worked on with the conservation dogs. This is just a fun poster from a film of the attack of the killer snails, which is how we all felt when we first found them back in 2013. Next slide. So New Zealand mudsnails, to give you a little bit of background, are really tiny. They're about the size of a grain of rice, just 4 millimeters, oftentimes smaller. And they have this operculum. It's a trap door that covers their opening, and that trap door allows them to resist desiccation and most chemical applications that we use to prevent their spread. So they can live out of water for 45 days, possibly longer, and they resist things like bleach, which is what we use to clean our equipment. And they're also clonal, so every New Zealand mudsnail in the United States is female, and she's each born with about 90 developing neonates inside of her, so little babies inside of her, which is incredibly troubling. So they can reproduce fairly quickly. Can you go to the next slide? We do have prevention efforts in place. We've got, it's law that everybody must inspect, remove, drain, and never move attached plants, animals, sediments from water body to water body. And the DNR has had a disinfection manual code that we impose on our staff because we have complicated equipment that we use going from water body to water body. We pose a higher risk. But when New Zealand mudsnails were first found in the state, we thought, wait, is our manual code preventing New Zealand mudsnails? And we realized that no, it wasn't. Because we were only telling our staff that they have to use bleach. Turns out bleach is not effective to prevent New Zealand mudsnails. So we rewrote our manual code and had to figure out how do we go out in these streams to see where they are. We have to know if what we're doing is preventing. So we increased the concentrations. We started using a lot more steam. We started using a lot more Burcon Aquatic. Can you go to the next slide? And then we went off in the winter of 2013-14 and sent our biologists out to about 100 different sites in the state of Wisconsin to see where else are they. We know they're here in Dane County. Are they other places? So they went out during the same winter as the polar vortex, mind you, to sample these locations. And we only found them in Dane County at the one known location, which was great. And since then, the map that you see in the center of the screen, that's all the places that we've looked for New Zealand mudsnails. It's well over 1,000, I think 3,000, 5,000 sites. We've looked a lot. We haven't found them a ton of places. And since then, we use our biologists out with DNets in the field. We've also done projects studying eDNA. So if there's DNA of the animals in the water, you can collect a cup of water and send it off to the lab to see if it has mudsnail DNA in it. And that has been somewhat effective, but we're still working on some prioritization projects to make sure that sampling is effective. Can you go to the next slide? And then we keep hearing about these conservation dogs that can be trained how to sniff out invasive species and a bunch of other things. So we thought we'd give it a try. Can you go to the next slide? But then knowing that our staff, we had all these concerns that they could possibly spread them. We thought, well, the dogs will spread them and you can't necessarily steam clean or Virkon a dog off. So we decided we would go out and collect the sediments and bring the sediments to the dogs to sniff. You go next slide. So we collected sediments, and then we also, within the sediments, we're like, well, there's a lot of other little critters and bugs that live in the sediments. What if the dog thinks that's a New Zealand mudsnail? So we collected several different species of macroinvertebrates so the dogs could be trained what New Zealand mudsnails are not. Go next slide. So this is our staff out in the field with these D-nets collecting the sediments. That was this summer. Go next slide. And this is what they did in the field. We ran 10 transects, so each one of those red lines is one transect. We went from bank to bank collecting sediments, and then we put the sediment in a bag, and then we would do that 10 times because we wanted lots of replicates. We learned through our eDNA projects that collecting more replicates, oversampling, just to see at what level do we need to collect it to be certain, because you're really looking for a needle in a haystack. So we had 10 different transects, and each one of those should have about the same sediments within each one of the baggies. So we had lots of replicates from these locations. If you go to the next slide, we sampled 9 different streams. There were 5 streams where we knew New Zealand mudsnails were there, and we knew about how many New Zealand mudsnails should be in each sample. We had one sample where we had pretty clear indication that there probably were New Zealand mudsnails present. We had one that was a completely unknown, and then 2 sites that were blanks. We had evidence from previous macroinvertebrate sampling that there were no New Zealand mudsnails in those locations. So, and from each of those, we collected these 10 replicates. So we had 90 samples of sediments that we sent for the dogs to sniff. Next slide. And then Laura.
All right, so hi everybody, I'm Laura. I know I can't see you, so it's really weird talking to myself. But I just want to introduce real quick the team behind Midwest Conservation Dogs. On this slide, you're looking at the 2-legged, very important team members here, but really the stars of our organization and this particular presentation are the 4-legged furry companions that are co-woofers out in the field. So we have currently 5 working dogs with the organization, and we're continuing to add to our team as the projects continue to grow. So today I'm just going to kind of give a quick overview on the training process that we did for this particular collaboration. So as Maureen said, the team collected and painfully went through sediment and isolated out the New Zealand mud snails. So the first part of the project to train our dogs that the snails equal good stuff, which for some of them is bacon. We collected just the snails, put them in some mason jars with mesh lids. And you see that on the picture on the left. That's the top-down view of that. We paired up the mason jar with food right on top of it. So the dogs on their own, they go in to smell. At first they might be smelling the bacon, but they soon learn over repetition that, oh, there's also this New Zealand mud snail stinky stuff in here too. So we do that process for a couple of days, sometimes a little bit more than a week, depending on the dog. And then we quickly move over to what we call an odor recognition test. So in this screenshot of Ernie, he is doing a quick run through of the New Zealand mud snails on the far left. And then behind him in the middle, we have some of his food actually is in that mason jar. And then we have a water bug on the far right side. And what we're doing here is just verifying that the dogs are starting to understand that it's the target odor of the New Zealand mud snail that is the thing we want them to find. And thus, then they get their bacon or toy play or whatever they're hankering that day. One of the next very important phases of this particular project was folding in a bunch of different approximations. So as you might imagine, there's different sediments out there that the New Zealand mud snails are calling their home. And then we're also training the dogs that sometimes it's just gonna be one snail, other times it might be a larger infestation. And then different training locations were folded in, knowing that the field work day, we're gonna do that outside in a parking lot type area. And then with the 2 dogs that were selected for this project, on the bottom right there, you see Canine Ernie, the yellow lab, and Canine Betty White, the black lab. We did a variable like who goes first today, you know, who goes second, who goes first. So we made sure that there wasn't any bias as far as Ernie always goes first and Betty's just basically tracking where he's been. And then the next phase, very important for the handlers especially, is to do some blind runs during the training. So my training partner, Clarice, she would come with me and she would set out a training setup, and she knew where the New Zealand mudsnails were, but I had no idea. And that obviously reduces any kind of unconscious, you know, cues I might be giving to the dogs that I know where stuff is, but they don't. So dogs are very good at picking up on their humans' body language, as anybody knows that owns a dog. So blind runs are very important as part of the training process. And that's little Canine Betty White showing me right where the New Zealand mudsnails are. All right, so after about 8 full weeks of training, we set a date to do the first set of surveys for the sediments that were pulled by the project partners. So we landed on November 12th, 2020. And that particular day we ran 35 different locations, and Canine Betty White and Canine Ernie were both set up to do the sniffing that day. And we had all of our project partners come together in the parking lot and just watch the dogs do their thing. So we had the layout of how this works. That particular day, we set up 7 different, I'll call them locations, 7 different mason jar locations with the sediments. And we did 5 separate runs that accounted for that 35 sediment total. My little diagram in the bottom right-hand corner gives you an idea what that kind of looked like. So Canine Ernie came out first. He did his run down and back on the 7 locations. We put him up and then brought Canine Betty White out to do the same 7 location smells. And there's little Nina, the New Zealand mudsnail. If Ellen, if you're on here watching, you guys will get to know Nina the mudsnail in a separate presentation. Okay, and then a couple weeks later, we did the remaining surveys with the dogs. We just did this at my house. That's me in my lovely backyard. I need a new driveway. Don't judge, but we use Canine Ernie and Canine Betty White again for that. Same set of parameters, you know, with the 7 mason jars, and I flipped a coin, who got to run first today, and so on and so forth. And what was really exciting was, from my standpoint, watching how quickly the dogs truly do work that type of straight line setup and how quick they are just to blast through those, I think it was 80 sediments in total that they sniffed. So overall, you know, after we got the data from the 2 field work days, we have some initial numbers that we are seeing. The probability of detection is 0.71 and the specificity is 0.6. So Maureen's going to talk a little bit more about what that means and, you know, where we're going to go from here next. But the 2 canines are looking forward to more sniffertunities to sniff out more New Zealand mudsnails. So Maureen, I'll pass it back over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Laura. So the biggest things that we know we could refine, because those numbers of 0.72 and 0.6 are pretty good, but they could probably be better, and they might be better. The biggest thing we could have improved would have been the training for the collectors, because it's clear that maybe not everybody did the same thing in all of the sites with running those transects from the left to the right bank. And then also how we ran the 10 replicates on the same transect. We probably exhausted the New Zealand mudsnails, or definitely took some out the first time we ran through. So we have to bump those transects up a little bit or slightly further, so we're not like exhausting all the New Zealand mudsnails from each of the transects. And then we have fewer that are in the bag, so fewer snails to detect. One thing that we definitely could do better, which we plan to, is that we don't know the exact number of snails that were present in each one of those bags of sediment. We know that there should have been some, but some where we thought they would have been detecting, there might not have been snails in that sample simply because we'd ran multiple transects through that transect already. And then we kept the transects in order. So maybe by the time they got to the 10th time that they were doing the replicates of that, there were no snails left. And those were the bags that we thought would have had snails in them, but they didn't. But we don't know for sure. So we're going to work on with work study students to go through each of those sediment bags because we have everything still, and it's still saved in those original jars and the original baggies of what the dog sniffed. We'll sort through those samples and get an actual count for what's present, and then our detection probability numbers will probably change. And I think, Laura, you had maybe approaches that you were going to mention too.
Yeah, with some of the dog training as well. You know, the beauty of working alongside dogs is that they are some of the best teachers when it comes to just what they're cueing off of or not. So, you know, 8 weeks of training was a pretty short amount of time in hindsight. I know we originally were talking, excuse me, early on in our collaboration, I was like, oh yeah, the dogs will be ready in a month. And then I got like 3 weeks into training. I was like, we need another month because there's so many variables. So part of the training, just continuing to fold in some of those approximations that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, as well as revisiting the actual layout of how those mason jars are set up. So we did a straight line. I'm really curious to set up more of a circle type of format where the dogs work around in a circle to eliminate any potential patterns that they might have been picking up on, 85% of the time that first location or the first, mason jar was hot. So I'm going to start just throwing an indication at you here, hoping to get my bacon. So just doing some analysis on that and really removing additional variables that might be affecting the dog's performance.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. And then the second bullet we have is integrated into surveillance programs. We would like to, once we have more confidence and certainty of what their detection ability is, work with the dogs as a regular surveillance tool. I know our partners have been interested and came up with really fun ideas. Matt Walrath from Matt Walrath from the Upper Sugar River Watershed started coming up with a fun phrase of a scoop for a scoop. During some of these volunteer events, have people bring in a scoop of sediments and then they get a scoop of ice cream or a little tag for a coupon for a Culver's ice cream. So there's fun ways we can integrate it. And then it's also, if they're truly like a good detection tool, there's just a lot of value in working with dogs. I guess next slide, then here's the poll questions.
Yeah, Joe, did you want to pop in and kind of help guide us for this?
Sure. Would you like me to share the results from the poll?
Yeah, we have time.
I sure can. Yep.
I think so. Oh, good.
Awesome. All right, so the first question we had was true or false, a dog's wet nose helps them scent better. The answer is true. So we got 100%.
Yeah.
Woohoo! Well done, people. Yeah, the moisture helps just the molecules of odor absorb on their nose and just stay around a little longer, right? Moisture makes things more stinky. That's just the simple way of thinking of it.
What's our next? Let's see. How big? No bigger than a grain of rice. Most people got that right. Oh, a quarter, we probably thrown out by the picture of comparison of size. Yeah, most people got that right. Good job.
I love this question. It's one of my favorites. Approximately how many scent receptors do dogs have? So 300 million is the correct answer. And we got about 2/3. That was really great. Oh, we got people coming in at the last second here too. Yeah, I know.
You give them the answer and then they start putting.
They're like, oh, yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah. Just FYI, people like humans, we have between 5 and 6 million. So if that gives you a little glimpse into the olfaction capabilities of a dog, I don't know what it will. How many different scents can a conservation dog be trained to detect? So This is actually, the correct answer is D. It's more than 15. There are some dogs out there that are in 15 to 20 category right now. Yeah. I mean, like lots of good variety across that one. All right.
Oh, so the next question, how can you prevent spreading New Zealand mud snails? Scrub and rinse my gear, steam clean by gear. I think, yeah, that one's worded a little funky.
Typos.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was maybe steam clean my gear. Scrub and rinse with acid and gasoline, then burn it. Scrub and rinse, scrub gear in Virkon Aquatic or Formula 409. The right answers were, well, scrub and rinse gear is good to do. Steam clean, I think that should have said steam clean, so I can see why people might not have selected that. And then the soak in gear, Virkon or Formula 409. So A and D are the clear correct answers. I think B would have been if it was steam.
All right, I think we have one more. There we go.
Yep. This was a question I put in for all of my dog lovers in the room, which a lot of us are. Just like every dog in the world should sniff, because the answer to this is all of these. All of the answers here are correct. So let your dog sniff. Go sniff with your dog.
All right, thank you too.